Elderly man gives his food to a bear. The next day, the unexpected happens. Frost Hollow always fell quiet when the snow came. It wasn't just the hush of winter, the soft blanket muffling sound. It was the way the town seemed to pull inward, like breath drawn and held tight. By late November, most folks had stocked their pantries and sealed their windows, preparing for the long hush that might last until March. Out at the edge of the forest, where the pine trees grew thick and the wind howled without mercy, Thomas Reed lived alone in a weather-beaten cabin with a smoke curling from its chimney and the woods pressing close on all sides. The locals called him the veteran, though most had never spoken more than a few words to him. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with streaks of silver in his beard and a limp he didn't bother to hide. No one knew exactly what war had carved into him, only that after he came back, he moved to the edge of nowhere and built a life from silence, wood smoke, and solitude. Thomas liked it that way. He had a daily rhythm, chopping wood, boiling water, scribbling notes in his worn leather journal, walking the perimeter of his land with an old hunting knife strapped to his belt. He wasn't a recluse out of bitterness, but because the noise of people, of small talk, of eyes watching and minds judging, felt heavier than snowdrifts. He hunted only when necessary, traded occasionally in town for salt or lamp oil, and otherwise kept company with the trees. The woods, at least, never lied. That night, the wind carried an edge colder than usual, and Thomas had just settled near the fire with a bowl of rabbit stew when he heard a sound outside. Heavy, deliberate steps crunching snow. He froze. A part of him registered danger immediately. He reached for the rifle hanging on the wall, but stopped halfway. The steps paused outside the door. For a moment, there was silence. Then came a low huff. Not human. A breath, heavy, raspy, not threatening, just tired. He eased the door open. A bear. Not a great roaring beast fresh from a nightmare, but a gaunt creature, shoulders hunched, fur matted with ice, eyes sunken, yet strangely aware. It stood about 10 feet away, not approaching, not backing off, just watching. A wild animal, half-starved and desperate, drawn by the scent of food and warmth. Thomas's grip tightened on the doorframe. Instinct told him to shout, to raise the rifle, to make himself large and drive it off. But the bear didn't growl, didn't rear up. It just stood there, ribs visible through its thick coat, steam rising from its nostrils. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe it was the soldier in him, the part trained to recognize pain behind silence. Maybe it was the man who had once cradled wounded friends on foreign soil, seen the way eyes dimmed when they gave up hope. Thomas turned, walked back inside, filled a chip bowl with hot stew, grabbed a thick slice of sourdough bread, and stepped back into the cold. The bear didn't move as he set the bowl down on the porch. He backed away slowly, raising his hands, not out of fear, but in a silent gesture of peace. The bear sniffed the air, lumbered forward, and lowered its head to the bowl. It ate slowly as if surprised by the gift. When it was done, it looked at Thomas again, not with the mindless surge of a beast, but with something almost resembling thought. Then it turned and vanished into the woods without a sound. Thomas stood there a long time after, letting the snow settle on his shoulders, the bowl empty at his feet. The next morning, he wasn't sure if he dreamed it. The bowl was still there, coated in a frozen sheen, and strange tracks led from the trees to his porch and back again. He didn't mention it in town later that week when he went to buy coffee and kerosene. Frost Hollow didn't take well to bear stories. They were tolerated in the woods, but only at a safe distance. People had long memories, especially when it came to threats. Still, the memory stayed with him. The way the bear had looked at him. Not like prey, not like predator. Just seen, recognized. 2 days passed. Snow thickened. Thomas spent the mornings clearing the roof and the afternoons tightening the chimney, flashing. He kept a bowl near the fire just in case. Part of him expected nothing. Part of him listened for every crunch in the snow. Then just after dawn on the third morning, he heard the sound again. He opened the door, breath catching in his throat. It was the bear. But this time she wasn't alone. Slung across her back, limp and small, was a cub. Its leg dangled at a strange angle, tied with strips of bark crudely fashioned into a splint. Blood crusted around the bindings, and the cub's breathing was shallow. The mother bear stood at the edge of the clearing, not advancing, waiting. Thomas's heart pounded. He understood, somehow. She remembered the food, the warmth, the absence of fear, and now she'd returned with her young, trusting him. He moved slowly, hands out. Easy, he murmured, not knowing if she could hear or understand. He crouched near the porch and reached into his coat, pulling out a wool blanket. Let me help. It took almost an hour to coax the cub close enough. But when he finally gathered the small body into the blanket and carried it inside, the mother didn't protest. She sat in the snow, silent, watching through the frosted window as Thomas laid the cub on a clean towel near the hearth. He boiled water, cleaned the wound, unwrapped the bark, and studied the damage. The splint had been crude, but functional, enough to prevent further harm, enough to show him that something extraordinary was happening. Thomas wrapped the leg properly with gauze and willow bark, fashioned a new splint with smoother edges, and dribbled warm broth into the cub's mouth with a spoon. Outside, the mother waited until nightfall, then vanished again into the trees. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, the cub breathing softly beside him, the snow falling like silence made visible. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. In town, whispers had begun, tracks near the roads. A bear seen near the ridge. People muttered about danger. Someone suggested a call to the wildlife department. Another mentioned tranquilizers. Fear was rising like frostbite through old wounds. But Thomas knew he had seen something else. Not just a wild animal, but a mother's desperation. A decision made in hunger and memory. A creature that had weighed the odds and chosen trust. He stared into the fire, the flames dancing in his tired eyes. The cub stirred beside him. Outside, the forest kept its secrets beneath a sky thick with snow. And at the edge of the world, something had begun to change. Morning came gray and heavy, the kind of winter light that never quite becomes day. Frost clung to the inside of the cabin windows, drawing delicate veins of ice across the glass, while the fire crackled low in the hearth. Thomas stirred from his chair with a groan, stiff from a night spent half sitting, half slumping beside the cub. It lay curled on a folded woolen blanket, one leg bound in clean cloth, its breathing slower now, more even. He touched the cub's side gently, feeling the shallow rise and fall, and for a moment something warm flickered in his chest. He had not felt this kind of connection in a long time. Not since the war, not since the hospital tents, where he'd sat beside younger men and whispered lies about how they'd be okay. This was different. This life was quiet, unspoken. Trust earned not through words, but through stillness. Outside, the snow had piled deep against the porch, softening the world to a dreamlike hush. There was no sign of the mother bear. He didn't know whether she'd gone to hunt or watch, or whether she'd simply decided that whatever came next was now out of her paws. Either way, Thomas was left with a wild creature and a question that sat heavier than any snowfall. What now? He went about his day in a fog of instinct, cutting firewood, checking the traps that lined the trees beyond his cabin, mostly empty, though he found one rabbit and thanked it softly before returning with the kill. He cooked carefully, adding meat to broth and steeping herbs in the pot, feeding the cub with a spoon when it stirred. The animal was small, too small to be alone this time of year, and though it flinched at first, it accepted the warmth of his hands, the sound of his voice murmuring nonsense in the still cabin. He didn't name it, not yet. Naming was a step he wasn't ready for. Names meant memories. Names meant loss. 3 days passed before the mother returned. Thomas was outside splitting kindling when he sensed it, the shift in silence, the pause in the wind. He turned, and there she was, standing just at the tree line, half hidden by snow-laden branches, massive and unmoving. Her eyes locked onto his, then drifted to the cabin window, where the cub's shape was visible in the dim glow of lamplight. Thomas lowered the axe slowly, breathing evenly. She didn't growl, didn't step forward. She just watched. He nodded once, unsure if the gesture meant anything to her, but somehow it felt necessary. From then on, she came every evening. She never approached the porch again, but she lingered near the clearing, visible only if Thomas knew where to look. Her eyes sometimes caught the light, 2 amber embers in the dusk, and when he stepped outside to bring in wood or shake snow from the roof, She remained still, a silent sentinel. In town, people had started talking louder. The tracks found near Henderson's farm, the distant growl heard by the middle school bus driver. The calls to the sheriff's office about bears straying too close to homes. No one yet suspected Thomas's cabin. No one imagined the line between man and wild had thinned right there at the forest's edge. Then came the knock. It was mid-morning, a week after the cub arrived. Thomas opened the door to find Rebecca Woods standing there in a heavy parka, clipboard under one arm, steam rising from her mouth as she smiled tightly. "Hope I'm not interrupting," she said, peering past him into the cabin. Her eyes were sharp, pale blue, the kind that missed little. She had come to Frost Hollow 2 years ago as part of a state conservation project. Young, confident, and slightly too curious for the town's liking. She didn't blend in easily, but she'd earned respect through persistence and a quiet empathy that echoed Thomas's own. "Heard some strange reports," she continued, stepping inside when he moved aside. "People say a bear's been seen more than once near the ridge, near here." Thomas said nothing at first. The cub was hidden in the back room, warm under blankets. He shut the door quietly before she noticed. "Bears move through," he said finally, voice gravelly. "Snow's deep this year. Not much food. They'll take chances." Rebecca studied him. "This isn't normal behavior. There are patterns, migration trails, denning zones. This one's not acting like the others." She paused, watching him. "You haven't seen anything unusual, have you?" Thomas met her gaze and to his own surprise nodded. "Yeah," he said, "I have." She blinked, clearly not expecting honesty. "Can I see it?" He hesitated, then motioned toward the back room. Rebecca followed him quietly, her boots creaking on the old wooden floor. When she saw the cub, she drew in a breath, not of fear but of awe. The animal looked up briefly, then settled again, unafraid. "Its leg," she murmured, kneeling beside it. "Splinted. Cleaned. This is your work?" "No," Thomas said. "The mother's. First, anyway. I just finished what she started." She looked up at him slowly. "The mother brought it here?" He nodded again. Silence stretched between them. Then she sat back on her heels. "This changes things." Over the next hour, Thomas told her everything. The soup, the bread, the first night, the silent stares in the snow. The sense that the bear knew something, that it remembered him, trusted him. Rebecca listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from disbelief to wonder to something else. A dawning realization that maybe, just maybe, they were witnessing a kind of miracle. "I need to tell someone," she said quietly as they stood near the fire. "Not the whole town, just the right people. Conservation officers, researchers. This isn't just behavior. This is communication. It's a decision. Do you understand how rare this is?" Thomas looked into the flames, jaw tight. "They'll come, with cameras, traps, needles. She won't come back if that happens." Rebecca bit her lip. "You're right. But if we're careful, if we document this the right way, we can protect them. We can prove that there's more going on in that bear's mind than instinct." He said nothing for a long time. Then finally he said, "One condition." She tilted her head. "You don't publish, not yet, not until they're safe. You tell who you must, but not the press, not the town, not until she's gone." Rebecca nodded solemnly. "Deal." After she left, Thomas stood in the doorway for a long while, watching the tracks her boots left in the snow disappear beneath fresh flakes. The bear was there again that night, a little closer this time. He stepped out onto the porch and, without thinking, said the word aloud. "Aurora." It felt right, not just for the soft shimmer of her eyes, but for the quiet beauty she brought to the dark. The bear didn't flinch, didn't retreat. She just blinked slowly, snow collecting on her fur like stardust. Then she turned and vanished once more into the woods. Inside, the cub slept on, its breath steady and calm. Thomas leaned against the doorframe, heart oddly full. A week ago, he'd been alone. Now he felt the weight of 2 lives, no 3, woven into his own. The storm, he knew, was coming. The clouds on the horizon promised it. But something had changed in the rhythm of the world, something fragile and profound. A wild bear had come seeking help. A cub had been laid at his door. And for the first time in years, Thomas Reed felt not haunted, but chosen. The wind began its long howl 2 nights later, a low, bone-deep moan that slid down the mountain like a warning whispered through pine needles. Thomas stood on the porch as the first real flakes of the coming storm fell, wide, lazy spirals of white that gave no hint of the fury building behind them. The clouds had thickened all day, dragging across the sky like bruises. He felt it in his bones before he saw it in the trees the way old men feel a storm in their knees. Something big was coming. Not just a snowstorm, but the storm, the kind locals whispered about in bars and remembered for decades. The kind that buried towns, cracked trees in half, and swallowed whole roads like they'd never existed. Inside, the cub, now limping but mobile, paced clumsily around the cabin. Its leg had healed just enough for walking, though Thomas still wrapped it each morning and watched closely for signs of swelling or pain. The mother hadn't appeared the night before, and that silence worried him. For days, she had returned like clockwork, sometimes with a rabbit in her mouth, which she left a few yards from the porch before vanishing again into the woods. Now she was gone, and the sky itself felt restless. He chopped double the wood that day, filled every pot and bucket with clean water, and reinforced the shutters with lengths of rope and nailed planks where the hinges had gone soft. As the wind picked up, he brought the cub's bedding closer to the hearth and moved his own cot nearby, forming a small island of warmth in the growing dark. By nightfall, snow was coming sideways, carried by gusts that screamed like wounded things through the trees. The cabin groaned and shifted under the weight of it, and Thomas sat up most of the night, listening, waiting. The fire hissed, the cub curled close to him, and somewhere out there in the white, Aurora was alone. By the second day, the storm had become something ancient. Roads vanished. Power lines snapped beneath the crush of snow and ice. In Frost Hollow, the town fell into silence, then panic. The radio stations went quiet. Cell towers froze. A family on the West End hadn't been heard from in over 24 hours, and the snowplows, useless against drifts 6 feet deep, remained trapped in their garages. Mayor Green issued a state of emergency, but help from the outside world was at least 3 days away, assuming any helicopter could even land. In the meantime, people were stuck, cold, and growing desperate. Thomas learned this when Rebecca appeared at his door, her face red and raw from windburn, her voice ragged with exhaustion. She'd hiked in from town after the storm made driving impossible, pushing through waist-deep snow to reach the only place she believed might still hold answers. "We need help," she said as he pulled her inside and handed her a mug of broth. "There's a family, 2 kids, maybe 3, stranded up by Ridge Hollow. I've tried to get there twice. I can't make it through." Thomas stared at her, the cup warm in his hand, heart beating slow and heavy. "Then they'll freeze." Rebecca nodded, her jaw tight. "Unless someone gets there tonight." He looked at the cub, then at the window. Snow whirled in thick curtains beyond the glass, erasing even the nearest trees. Then he stood. "Come on." They dressed in layers. Thomas in his old military coat, patched and lined with fleece. Rebecca in a snow-wet parka she hadn't taken off since the day before. He strapped a pack with rope, flares, and extra blankets, checked the knife at his belt, and shouldered an axe just in case. Before they stepped out, he turned to the cub. "Stay," he said quietly, not knowing if it understood, but hoping some part of it did. Then they stepped into the blizzard. Visibility was a cruel joke. The wind pushed sideways so hard it felt like ice shards carving their skin. Thomas led the way, his boots sinking deep, Rebecca trailing just behind. They hadn't gone more than 100 yards when he stopped, frozen by a shape in the snow ahead. Tall, broad-shouldered, unmoving. Aurora. She emerged from the white like a ghost, her fur coated in frost, eyes lit with something almost human. She stood perfectly still, then turned and began walking. Not away, but forward, along a hidden path that wound through the drifts like she'd memorized it from above. Thomas followed without hesitation. For hours, they trudged behind her, the bare-breaking trail, her bulk parting the snow like a plow. She stopped often, checking over her shoulder, waiting for them to catch up. At one point, they lost her in the wind, panic spiking in Thomas's chest, until she reappeared just feet ahead, waiting. Rebecca didn't speak once. She didn't have to. Her wide eyes and white-knuckled grip on his shoulder told him everything she felt. awe, fear, wonder. They found the car half buried at the edge of a ravine, its back end twisted from a slide off the icy road. Inside, three people huddled beneath blankets, parents and a young girl, unconscious from cold. Rebecca crawled inside, checking pulses, eyes, breath. "She's alive," she cried. "All of them, barely." Thomas moved quickly. He used the axe to free the driver's side door, then unrolled the emergency blankets, wrapping the girl first. He lit a flare to signal their location. Though in the blizzard, it might as well have been firelight swallowed by fog. Aurora waited beside the car, unmoving. The way back was worse. Carrying the girl sapped Thomas's strength. Rebecca helped the mother walk. The father limped. At one point, Thomas fell to his knees, legs screaming from the cold and weight. He thought he wouldn't get up, but then Aurora doubled back, lowering her massive body close, offering her flank as a brace. He leaned against her without thinking, used her to stand, and together they walked. It took nearly 4 hours to reach the town's edge. People screamed when they saw them emerge from the storm, at first in terror, then in disbelief. The bear vanished again into the trees before anyone could react. Paramedics took the girl. The parents sobbed. Rebecca stood beside Thomas, shaking from cold, eyes shining. "She led us," she whispered. "She saved them." By morning, the blizzard began to ease. The sun broke through in fractured shards, lighting the frozen world like crystal. Roads remained buried. Trees had fallen, but the town was alive. People who had once whispered about danger now spoke with reverence. They didn't call her a monster anymore. They called her a guardian. Thomas returned to the cabin to find the cub still there, blinking sleepily near the fire. Aurora appeared again that night, standing at the clearing's edge. She looked thinner, wearier. But when she saw the cub limping toward the window, she huffed, a low, gentle sound, and Thomas felt the air change. The next morning she was gone. No tracks, no sign, just a hush in the woods and the soft trail of memory she left behind. Thomas sat beside the hearth, watching the cub. The storm had taken much, but it had given something too. A story, a bond, proof that the world still held mystery, still bent in the direction of grace when you met it with kindness. And in the silence of the snow-covered forest, he whispered her name once more. Aurora. Spring didn't come easily to Frost Hollow. It arrived slowly, like a shy guest at the edge of a long, silent room, peeking around corners before stepping fully into view. The snow didn't melt so much as withdraw in stages, reluctant to release its hold on the land. By mid-March, the wind lost its bite, and patches of brown earth began appearing beneath the trees, like old scars revealed after a long winter's bandage. The town emerged too, quietly, cautiously. Roads reopened, roofs were repaired, and stories spread faster than the melt. But the story that mattered most didn't come from the mayor or the rescue teams. It came from the mouths of children, from the whispers of grandparents, from Rebecca Woods standing in front of a community hall packed shoulder to shoulder with townsfolk still wearing layers of fleece and flannel. It came from the truth Thomas never intended to share, but which had found its way into every heart regardless. She stood before them with photographs, not of the bear herself, for Aurora had never allowed any, but of tracks, of Thomas's journal sketches, of the path she had carved through the snow that night. Rebecca's voice never rose above steady calm, never sensationalized. She spoke like a witness, not a storyteller. "We were not rescued by coincidence," she said. "We were not lucky. We were guided by an animal who made a choice to trust, to help." Some scoffed, of course. A few muttered about romanticizing danger, about letting wild things stay wild, but more nodded, more sat silent, remembering the stories that had poured out in the weeks since the storm. Of a bear glimpsed beside a snow-covered fence line, a shadow that nudged a child's lost mitten back toward her hand, a shape that stood still near a collapsed shed, and later it was found to be guarding an unconscious man trapped inside. Too many sightings, too many quiet salvations, too much grace to ignore. And still, no one had seen her again. Aurora had vanished after the storm, disappearing into the thaw like a dream too good to last. Thomas searched for signs, of course. Fresh claw marks on birch trunks, overturned stones, the odd broken branch. But nothing told him she was near. Only the cub remained, It had grown stronger by the week, its limp fading as the muscles rebuilt, its spirit shining bright and curious in the mornings when the sun warmed the cabin floor. He built it a larger enclosure just beyond the porch, a safe space to stretch and explore without risking town panic. The animal seemed content, but sometimes when the night came and the wind shifted, it would pause at the edge of the tree line and whine, soft, unsure, waiting. Thomas understood the feeling. Rebecca came often now, walking up from town with a thermos of tea and a folder tucked under her arm. She talked about plans, about protected land, about a wildlife corridor that would stretch along the ridge to allow bears and other animals safe passage without conflict. "We could build something lasting," she told him one afternoon as they sat on a felled log near the clearing. "Not just a trail, a future." He nodded slowly. He had no interest in politics or proposals, but something in the idea stirred him. The thought of space not only shared, but honored. "They'll fight it," he said. "The developers, the old guard." Rebecca sipped her tea. "Maybe, but stories like yours make it harder to say no." He glanced at her. "It's not mine, it's hers." Still, word spread. A petition gained signatures. Grants were filed. By summer, stakes marked the edges of future fencing, not to keep animals out, but to guide them safely around roads and homes. Signs were posted, bear crossing, slow down, half joking at first, then not. Frost Hollow had been small and set in its ways for decades, but something about that winter had cracked open its sense of certainty. The bear had done something no council meeting ever could. She'd shifted the ground beneath people's feet, made them look, made them feel. The cub was released in late June. They'd waited as long as they could, making sure it could hunt, navigate, and survive without human aid. Thomas carried no illusions. He knew the risks. Young bears didn't always make it. But the cub had strength now, and when the gate was opened, it stepped out not with fear but purpose, pausing only once to glance back at the man who'd fed it, warmed it, held it through the worst of winter. That single glance hit Thomas harder than he expected. Not because it was farewell, but because it wasn't. It was something else. A promise, maybe, or just recognition. He watched the cub disappear into the trees, swallowed by green and gold, and whispered his last words into the wind. "Stay wild." Summer deepened, then fall. Thomas spent his days fixing the cabin, splitting wood, attending the occasional town gathering when Rebecca coaxed him out of his quiet. Children waved when they saw him. Some even called him the Bear Man, their eyes wide with wonder. He didn't correct them. Let them have their story. It was true enough. One morning in October, he woke before dawn and stepped onto the porch, coffee steaming in his hand. The air was crisp, the stars fading into pale pink above the ridge. Then, without warning, the trees moved. Just slightly, just enough. A shape emerged, massive, slow, certain. Aurora. She stood at the edge of the clearing, frost catching in the fur along her spine, her breath clouding in the early light. And beside her, taller now, broader across the shoulders, was the cub. Thomas didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply set the coffee down, walked to the edge of the porch, and stood still. Aurora stepped forward once, then stopped. Her eyes met his across the thinning grass. Then she turned, brushed her nose gently against the cub's flank, and together they vanished. That was the last time he saw them. But it wasn't the end. Months passed. The wildlife corridor opened the next spring. A bridge was constructed across a highway known for animal collisions. Thomas was there for the ribbon cutting, standing at the back, hands shoved in his coat pockets. He didn't like attention, but Rebecca insisted. "It's for them," she'd said, "not us." The mayor made a short speech, awkward but sincere, then stepped aside to reveal the metal sign mounted on the trailhead. Etched in bronze were the words, "Aurora Passage," in honor of one bear's path and the man who walked beside her. Below was an image, a bear beside a figure in a coat, silhouetted against falling snow. Thomas said nothing. But as the wind rose and pine needles stirred, he allowed himself a small, quiet smile. Frost Hollow changed, slowly but undeniably. More people walked the woods with reverence. Hunters posted warnings about dens. Children learned to identify tracks, not with fear, but fascination. And somewhere out in the deep hush of wild country, A bear lived. She had chosen trust. And in doing so, she had rewritten an entire town's understanding of the word. Years later, the story would be told again and again, by firelight, in schoolrooms, on the plaque outside the library. Some would question its truth. Others would swear they'd seen her too. But Thomas would never argue. He didn't need to. He had lived it. And when he sat alone on his porch, coffee in hand, the snow beginning to fall once more, he would glance toward the trees and wonder if tonight would be one of those rare nights. The kind where old friends return not in body, but in memory, in breath, in wind, in the gentle shift of shadows through the woods. And sometimes, just sometimes, he would believe he saw her watching. Still wild, still watching, still there. Years passed the way snowfall covers earth, quietly, layer by layer, almost without notice. Frost Hollow kept its rhythm, weathered its storms, and carried forward with the kind of steady resilience that only small towns nestled against wilderness ever really understand. There were new faces and old stories, new homes and old wounds, but through it all, one truth lingered beneath everything like the roots of the pines. A bear once came to a man's doorstep, and that man gave her soup instead of fear. Children learned the tale before they learned cursive. Tourists who ventured up the ridge in autumn were told to watch for tracks that might belong to descendants of a legend. And every now and then, someone would pause at the bronze plaque at the trailhead, trace the silhouette of man and beast, and whisper the name as if it meant something sacred. Aurora. Thomas Reed aged with the forest. He didn't resist it. He welcomed the way time softened his bones and slowed his stride. The limp in his right leg grew worse with each winter, but he never left the cabin. It had become a part of him, just as the woods had. He carved walking sticks from deadwood now, not out of need for income. Rebecca had ensured he was always provided for, but because he liked the feel of shaping something with his hands. There was peace in the act of creation, in turning what had once fallen into something that could support someone else. Rebecca visited often at first, then less frequently as her work expanded and pulled her farther from the valley. She never stopped writing him, though. Her letters came like snowmelt, slow, steady, full of warmth. She sent updates about the wildlife corridor, the migration data, the bears being spotted farther and farther along protected trails. She even mentioned once a bear seen near Cedar Pass with markings that reminded her of Aurora, wide shoulders, dark muzzle, and a cautious but unafraid posture toward humans. Thomas didn't ask for more. He didn't need proof. Some things are truer than evidence. He still walked the edge of the woods every morning, his coat patched and faded, his boots heavy with age. The trail from his porch to the ridge had grown familiar under his feet, like a song hummed endlessly through the seasons. He rarely saw animals up close anymore. They knew him now, knew his scent, and respected his quiet. But every so often he would find something that made him stop. A deep print in the mud, a snapped branch angled high, a single tuft of fur snagged on bark. Signs like breadcrumbs in the wilderness. Not of just any bear. Her. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the trees and the sky turned the color of ash and fire, Thomas sat on his porch with a mug of tea cooling in his hands. His breath fogged in the growing chill, and he watched the shadows shift like old memories through the timberline. The wind carried scents, painted on old leaves, something else. Something familiar. He felt it before he saw it. A shape moving slow and steady along the ridgeline, just at the edge of sight. Broad, massive, powerful. Not a threat, a presence. The bear paused, silhouetted by the dying light, and turned its head toward him. It didn't come closer. It didn't need to. Thomas raised his hand in the smallest of waves. The bear blinked, then vanished into the trees. He sat still for a long while afterward, the cold forgotten, heart thudding softly like a drum wrapped in flannel. He didn't question if it was Aurora or her grown cub, or another entirely. That wasn't the point. What mattered was that she had come back, or something had. The circle, in some quiet, sacred way, was complete. Later that fall, a storm came. Not as fierce as the blizzard from years ago, but wild in its own way. Howling winds and driving sleet, lightning splitting the sky like anger released. Thomas weathered it from inside, fire crackling in the hearth, soup simmering on the stove. He thought, as he often did during storms, of the night she first came to him, of the hollow desperation in her eyes and the raw weight of her hunger, and the way, against all instinct, she had chosen not to run or attack but to stay. That memory lived in him like marrow. It shaped everything that came after. In the days following the storm, he walked the trail again. Trees had fallen. The brook near the ridge had flooded its banks. He cleared what he could, propped up what he couldn't, and paused often to catch his breath. His hands trembled more now. His knees ached more loudly. Still, he kept moving. It wasn't until he reached the clearing, the same one where he'd once seen her waiting after the blizzard, that he stopped entirely. There, pressed into the soft mud beside a fallen log, was a single paw print. Fresh, deep, large. He knelt beside it slowly with effort, ran his fingers along the edge. The shape of it was like a memory made solid. The earth still held her weight. The woods somehow still remembered. That night, he wrote a final page in the old leather journal he had kept since before the war. The one filled with maps and sketches and silent thoughts too heavy to speak aloud. He didn't write about himself. He didn't write about what he'd seen. He wrote a message. To whoever finds this, it began, "This place is sacred, not because of me, but because something wild and gentle once crossed its edge and showed us who we could be. If you come here, walk softly, listen often, and never ever underestimate what a single act of kindness can awaken." He left the journal in a wooden box beneath a stone near the porch, wrapped in wax cloth to keep it dry. A gift someday for a wanderer, or a child, or a lost soul looking for more than a trail. Then he made tea, lit a candle, and sat in his old chair, wrapped in the silence he had long since made peace with. He closed his eyes as the wind rose again outside, rustling the trees, brushing gently against the windows, as if something enormous had passed by without a sound. Thomas Reed died quietly that night, with no fear and no regret. When the town found him days later, alerted by Rebecca, who hadn't heard from him in weeks, they buried him at the edge of the woods, just beneath the ridge where the trail crests and the sky opens wide above the trees. A flat stone marked the spot. No grand words, just a name, a year, and an engraving below, a bowl of soup beside a bear's paw print. In the years that followed, people kept coming. Hikers, students, dreamers. They walked Aurora Passage with reverence, leaving small offerings at the trailhead, stones, flowers, sketches, handwritten notes tied with string. Some swore they saw movement in the trees, a shadow that paused too long to be wind. Others claimed they heard a huffing breath behind them, not close but not far either. Watching. Rebecca kept the corridor alive. She expanded the protections. She taught young rangers to track with compassion, not control. And every year on the first snowfall, she climbed to the cabin alone and stood on the porch in silence, remembering the man who had given her faith in what the world could be. And far beyond the trails, where people no longer walked, a bear lived. Older now, slower, but still watching, still walking, still wild. And where she stepped, the forest remembered. Elderly woman rescues bear cubs. When the grizzly returns, no one expects what follows. The wind had begun its haunting song before nightfall, a low, rising howl that curled through the pine trees and wrapped itself around the cabin like a warning. Inside, Margaret Holloway moved with slow precision, feeding the fire one log at a time, checking the pantry, counting the remaining jars of canned soup, and boiling water for tea. Outside, snow fell in thick sheets, swallowing the path to the woodshed and erasing all signs of Henry's footprints. He had left 2 days ago with his old rifle and his orange hunting cap pulled down tight, promising to be back before the storm hit. "It'll just brush the edge of Holloway Ridge," he'd said, the kind of confident guess only someone who'd lived in the mountains too long could make. Margaret hadn't argued. She rarely did. The woods had taught her long ago that arguing with nature, or with stubborn men, was like shouting into the wind. She'd simply nodded and watched him vanish into the trees. Now, 2 days later, there was no sign of Henry, and the storm was no longer a rumor. It roared like a beast unleashed, battering the roof and shutters with a fury that made the old cabin tremble at its joints. Margaret sat near the hearth, sipping weak chamomile tea, her fingers curled around the mug, not for the drink, but for its warmth. Her bones ached more with each winter, and tonight they felt brittle, like twigs underfoot. The power had been out since morning. I am on here has a saying morning, not that she relied on it much. The old generator in the shed was frozen solid. She had candles, oil lamps, wood, and blankets. She would survive. She always did. Still, something gnawed at her. Not just the silence, which she had grown to welcome in her solitude, but the absence of a sound she hadn't realized she counted on. Henry's whistling as he walked back from the ridge, the crunch of his boots on snow. She had known him for nearly 30 years. Not friends, exactly. Not lovers. Just nearby. A presence. The kind of neighbor who never asked questions, but always brought extra eggs if his hens laid well. Margaret had chosen this life after everything fell apart. After the fire, after losing her family, after the city swallowed her grief with its noise. Here, in the stillness of Holloway Ridge, she'd begun to breathe again. She wasn't ready to lose another thread of connection, however thin it had become. The wind paused just for a breath, and in that rare hush, Margaret heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Low, guttural, and too deliberate to be the creak of trees. She set down her mug and stood slowly, every joint resisting. Slipping on her heavy coat, scarf, and boots, she grabbed the lantern by the door and lit it with practiced fingers. The flame flickered weakly but held. She opened the door and stepped into the white, her breath caught in a gasp as the cold bit through everything. The sound came again, closer now, a kind of strangled growl muffled by snow and wind. Margaret followed it past the frozen porch, into the trees where the drifts reached her knees. The lantern swung with each step, casting golden light on bent pine branches and ghostly snowbanks. Then she saw it. At the base of a pine, half buried in snow and blood, lay a bear, massive, panting, her chest heaving with effort. One leg was trapped in a steel-jawed device, the kind Margaret hadn't seen in decades. Illegal now, but some men still set them deep in the woods, hoping to catch something worth skinning. The bear's fur was slick with red, her breath shallow. Her eyes found Margaret, not in rage, but in something closer to pain or resignation. And beside her, three small shapes, trembling and huddled together, eyes wide with fear. Cubs. Margaret froze. Every instinct told her to back away slowly, to avoid the wrath of a wounded mother. But the bear didn't growl again. She just looked, unmoving. And the cubs, no bigger than shepherd dogs, whimpered softly, pressing into each other for warmth. Margaret knelt, ignoring the wet cold seeping into her pants. The bear's leg was ruined, muscle and bone crushed by the trap. There was no saving her, no dragging her back, no way to free her that wouldn't cause more agony. She didn't cry out as Margaret inspected the injury, only flinched slightly, then settled again with a deep exhale. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered, her breath a ghost between them. She stood and, from her coat pocket, pulled a revolver, an old, clean piece she hadn't used in years, reserved only for wolves or worse. She looked at the cubs, then back at the mother. "I won't let you suffer." One shot. The forest went silent again. The cubs cried out, stumbling back. Margaret dropped the gun into the snow and pressed her gloved hands to her eyes. When she could breathe again, she moved forward, gathering the cubs one by one. They were light, frightened, claws scraping her coat, but they didn't bite. Their warmth bled into her chest as she bundled them close. She walked back through the storm with her arms full, leaving the mother behind in a grave of snow and steel. Inside the cabin, she laid them on a thick wool blanket near the hearth. They curled into each other immediately, still shaking. Margaret moved quickly, setting a pot of milk to warm, crushing an old tin of dog biscuits into powder. She remembered caring for orphaned animals on her father's farm, calves, raccoons, even a fox once. She found the old, rubber-tipped baby bottles in the cupboard, still clean. The first cub resisted, but drank eventually. The others followed. The fire crackled louder, fighting the cold that had snuck in with them. The snowstorm outside roared on, but in here something was happening, something Margaret hadn't felt in years. She sat in the rocking chair beside the fire, three cubs sleeping at her feet, her hands wrapped around a new cup of tea. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. The wind began to ease by morning, but the world remained locked in silence, blanketed in a deep and undisturbed white. Margaret Holloway awoke in her chair, her neck stiff and her back sore, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Her first thought wasn't of Henry or the snow outside, but of the small lives sleeping beneath her faded wool blanket. She leaned forward slowly, and there they were. Three tiny bears curled together like fallen leaves, their chests rising and falling in gentle rhythm, their fur now dry, their small bodies warmer than they'd been in days. For a long moment she simply watched them, something short and unfamiliar blooming in her chest. The grief she'd carried for so long had always been cold and dense, like a stone at the bottom of a lake. But this was warmth rising up through the cracks. Carefully she stood, stirring the fire back to life, then slipped into the kitchen. She warmed more goat's milk and crushed the last of her dog biscuits, setting the mixture into the bottles with clumsy but steady hands. They would need more food soon, real food, but she'd figure that out later. For now, she could give them this. The cub stirred when she knelt beside them. Cedar first, his small face bold and nose twitching at the scent. He scrambled over his siblings, nudging the bottle eagerly. Birch followed, cautious but hungry. Juniper took longer, blinking up at her with sleepy confusion before she finally accepted the milk. Margaret whispered their names aloud, unsure where they'd come from, only that they fit. Cedar, the brave one. Birch, the curious. Juniper, the soft soul. She spoke to them gently, telling them stories of the ridge, of how their mother had been fierce and brave, and how the forest, cruel though it could be, was still full of wonders. They didn't understand, of course, but they listened in their own way. The day passed like a strange dream, the outside world lost behind thick layers of snow and frost. Margaret moved about the cabin with purpose, retrieving old towels, cleaning up a few paw-shaped messes, checking her stores. There wasn't much left, certainly not enough to keep three cubs fed for long, but she pushed the worry down deep, one day at a time. That was how she'd lived for years. It would be enough now. The snowstorm left behind a quiet too deep to ignore. The cabin walls creaked. Somewhere in the woods, trees cracked under the weight of ice. Margaret opened the door only once, stepping onto the porch to breathe in the cold air and look toward the ridge. Nothing but white. No tracks. No sign of Henry. She held the edge of the doorway for balance, heart twisting in her chest. "Damn fool," she muttered, her voice rough. She stood there for another minute, scanning the stillness, hoping, but there was no movement, just wind. It was 2 days later when the knock came. It was hard, sharp, urgent. Margaret was in the kitchen, rinsing out the bottles when she heard it. Her first instinct was fear. No one knocked on her door, not in the middle of winter, not way out here. She grabbed the rifle from behind the doorframe, not loaded but heavy and convincing. She cracked the door, and there he stood, Thomas Grady, tall, broad-shouldered, and slick with snow. His coat looked newer than the man inside it, and his eyes held the same predatory gleam they always had. He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Mornin', Miss Holloway," he said, his voice syrupy. "Hell of a storm. Thought I'd check in on you." Margaret didn't move. "No one checks on me, Grady. What do you want?" His smile tightened. "Saw bear tracks near the old creek bed. Real fresh. Thought maybe you'd seen something. Heard one of the mother bears might have gotten herself caught." Margaret didn't answer. Her grip on the door didn't loosen. Grady tilted his head, trying to peer past her into the cabin. "Mighty warm in there. Smells like milk." Margaret's heart thudded once hard. "Go home, Grady." But he stepped forward. "You wouldn't happen to be harboring wildlife, would you? That's a federal offense, you know." He said it casually, like asking about the weather. Before she could reply, a sound broke the tension. A low growl, long and deep, from somewhere beyond the cabin. Grady froze. Margaret blinked. She hadn't heard it at first, hadn't even registered it above her pulse, but now it was unmistakable. She turned her head just slightly and followed Grady's gaze past the porch, across the snowy clearing. There, emerging from between two thick pines, stood a grizzly. Not just any grizzly, a giant, towering beast with thick brown fur, wide shoulders, and black, unreadable eyes. He didn't move fast. He didn't charge. He simply walked forward with a slow, deliberate confidence, the snow crunching beneath his weight, the air around him silent with reverence. Margaret had never seen him before, but something about him felt all old, ancient even, like the forest had carved him from its heartwood and sent him here for a reason. Grady stepped back, his hand moving toward the hunting knife on his belt. The bear paused, 10 feet from the porch, and let out another sound, not a roar, not a scream, but something primal and warning. Grady froze. Margaret could see the calculation behind his eyes. He wasn't afraid of much, but this was something different. This was the wild, looking back at him with no fear. "You brought him here, didn't you?" Grady hissed. Margaret said nothing. The bear took a single step closer. Grady backed away quickly now, slipping in the snow, cursing under his breath. "This isn't over," he spat before turning and stumbling into the trees. The bear didn't follow. He stood there for a few more moments, watching the retreating figure, then slowly turned and disappeared into the woods like smoke. Margaret stood still, her hands trembling. She exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, and finally closed the door. Inside, the cubs stirred again, sensing something, perhaps remembering a scent. Margaret knelt beside them, pressing her hands to their small backs. "Your father?" she whispered. "Your guardian?" She didn't know, not really, but she did know this. The wild had seen fit to send her 3 cubs and a bear to guard them. And somehow, in that strange, sacred arrangement, she was not alone. Margaret woke to the sound of scratching, soft, rhythmic, just beneath the windowsill. She rose slowly, her knees stiff, and approached the frost-covered glass. Outside, the sky was still dark, a hazy lavender as dawn threatened to arrive. Beneath the sill, 3 small noses poked out from the snow, followed by curious black eyes. The cubs had found a way out through a loose board by the fireplace and had wandered into the cold before realizing they missed the fire. She sighed, pushed the door open, and stepped into the brittle morning air. "You lot are going to be the death of me," she muttered, gathering them up one by one. Cedar resisted, pawing at the snow with a stubborn growl. Birch climbed onto her boot as if it were a log. Juniper shivered violently and pressed into her side. She brought them in, set them down before the fire, and refastened the plank. They were growing stronger. That much was clear. Cedar's steps were bolder, Birch's eyes more alert, and even Juniper, though still timid, had begun to explore the cabin in tentative loops, but it also meant they would need more food. Her stores had nearly vanished. There were a few more cans of beans, some hardtack, and a bag of oats. No meat, no milk. And the goats hadn't been milked in 3 days because of the storm. They would be weak now, too. By mid-morning, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting brilliant spears of gold across the icy trees. Margaret bundled herself in layers, armed herself with the old sled, and made her way down the slope to the goat shed. The path was treacherous, coated in black ice beneath the snow. She walked carefully, the sled rope wrapped around her wrist. Inside the shed, she found the goats huddled, bleating softly, alive but hungry and cold. She fed them hay, warmed their water, and milked the 2 still willing to stand. It wasn't much, but it would get the cubs through another day. She returned to the cabin to find Cedar on top of the kitchen table, Birch tearing at a pillow, and Juniper nosing the edge of the fireplace again. "You're savages," she declared, hands on hips. "Absolute little devils." But she laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. They looked up at her with wide eyes and tilted heads, as if confused by the sound. By evening, they were curled together once more, snoring gently. Margaret sat by the fire, sewing up the tear in the pillow when a knock sounded. Her hand froze mid-stitch. Not again. She stood and took the rifle in one hand before opening the door a crack. But it wasn't Grady. It was Henry, or what remained of him. He was slumped against the doorframe, face white with cold, beard frozen, his coat shredded along one sleeve and blood dried along his side. "I told you I'd be back before the storm," he rasped, half grinning, before sagging forward into her arms. She caught him, just barely, and dragged him inside, shouting at him through clenched teeth. "You damn fool, what were you thinking?" But he couldn't answer, already slipping into unconsciousness. She laid him on the sofa and worked quickly, cutting away the coat, cleaning the wounds, stitching what she could, feeding him spoonfuls of broth once he was able to swallow. He had a deep gash across his ribs and a twisted ankle. From the look of him, he'd been living off snow and bark for days. When he finally stirred, it was almost dawn again. The cubs approached him cautiously, sniffing, curious. Henry blinked at them, then at Margaret. "Are those what I think they are?" She nodded. "Their mother's dead. I found her in a trap. And you brought them in? He said, voice hoarse but steady. Of course you did. She braced for judgment, for the lecture she didn't want, but he just smiled faintly and said, You've always had a strange heart, Margaret Holloway. She stared at him a long moment. You're not going to report me? Hell no, he said. After what I've seen, I got no business telling anyone how to survive. Over the next 2 days, Henry regained strength, and with it, the story came out. He'd slipped while crossing a frozen stream and tumbled into a ravine, fracturing his ankle and slicing his side on a jagged rock. He'd crawled, inch by inch, through the woods, trying to follow the scent of smoke. He'd heard something moving behind him in the dark. Thought it was a wolf, but it had never come close. Maybe it was your big bear, he said, watching Margaret from his chair. The one that scared off Grady. She nodded slowly. I think he's still nearby. Henry looked out the window, then at the cubs. Maybe he's waiting. For what? For you to finish what you started. The peace didn't last. On the third morning, they heard the crunch of tires on snow. Margaret looked up from her sewing. Henry reached for his coat. Through the frost-covered window, they saw them. Grady, 2 other men, and a state game warden in a dark green jacket. Grady wore a smirk that made Margaret's stomach twist. She stepped outside before they could knock. Whatever you think I've done, I haven't. We know what you've done, Grady snapped. You're harboring wildlife. That's a violation. Dangerous, irresponsible. Could cost lives. The game warden stepped forward. Ma'am, we've had reports. If you're keeping cubs, they're alive because I brought them in, she interrupted. Their mother was caught in a trap, bleeding, dying. I did what any decent person would. Grady sneered. You played God more like. You made them dependent. You endangered the town. Endangered them? Margaret said, voice rising. You're the danger. You and your traps. The standoff grew thick. Henry stepped outside with his crutch, standing beside her, and she's telling the truth. Those cubs wouldn't have lasted a night. And your trap, Grady, is what started this. But Grady wasn't listening. He pushed forward, brushing past her, hand on his holster. Move aside or I'll move you. That's when it happened. A growl, low and thunderous, rolled out from the trees. Everyone froze. From the woods, like before, came the grizzly, not charging, not snarling, just stepping forward with slow, deliberate weight, a sentinel of the forest. His breath steamed in the cold, his eyes locked on Grady, and he kept coming. The warden stepped back. Jesus. Grady reached for his weapon. Don't, Margaret barked. Don't you dare. But Grady raised it, hand trembling. And then, another sound, a softer one. Behind Margaret, the cabin door opened and the cubs stepped out. Cedar first, bold and unafraid. Birch followed, Juniper trailed behind. They didn't run to the bear. They didn't run away. They simply stood there watching. The bear paused. Something passed between them all. Something primal, deep, wordless. Then, just as quietly, the bear turned and walked away, vanishing into the trees like a shadow swallowed by light. No one spoke for a long time. Then the sheriff's voice broke through the silence. Sheriff Collins had arrived quietly, unnoticed, standing at the edge of the trail. I think it's clear where the danger is, and it isn't her. Grady sputtered, but Collins raised a hand. We're calling a vote, tonight. The town decides. That evening, bundled in coats and scarves, the townsfolk gathered outside the small church. Margaret stood near the back, the cubs sleeping beside Henry's boots. One by one, people raised their hands. Some out of respect, some out of awe, some because they had seen something bigger than laws and boundaries. When it was done, Collins turned to her and said, You've got your sanctuary. Holloway Ridge is now a protected corridor, for them and for you. Margaret looked up at the stars. For the first time in decades, they felt close enough to touch. The snow had begun to melt in thick, dripping sheets, loosening from tree limbs and eaves, turning the silence of winter into the steady sound of falling water. It was the kind of thaw that brought more mud than beauty, but to Margaret Holloway, it felt like rebirth. The days grew longer, the nights softer, and for the first time in months, she no longer feared what might wait outside her door. The cubs had grown quickly. Cedar now tall enough to put his paws on the table if he stood, Birch constantly tumbling into barrels and baskets, Juniper becoming more adventurous, less timid, more herself. They no longer whimpered at thunder or flinched at the wind. They played. They climbed. They explored the edges of the cabin's clearing with the cautious curiosity of wild things, remembering what it meant to be free. And Margaret, for all her aches and old bones, kept up as best she could. She reinforced the back fence so they could wander without slipping into danger. She found new feeding spots along the edge of the woods where they could dig and scratch. She even began reading aloud to them in the evenings, not because they understood the words, but because it filled the silence with something warm. Henry had taken to sitting on the porch each afternoon, one leg stretched stiffly in front of him, sipping coffee and talking to the cubs as though they were neighbors stopping by for a chat. "Cedar's going to be a fighter," he said one morning, watching the cub wrestle a log. "Bet he takes after his dad." Margaret smiled. "If it is his dad, who else would come storming out of the trees like that to protect them?" Henry asked. "That bear's not just wandering, he's watching." And it was true. They hadn't seen the grizzly up close since the standoff with Grady, but Margaret felt his presence in the woods. Once she'd caught his silhouette at twilight warning, high on the ridge, unmoving like a carved statue. Another time she found fresh tracks by the goat shed, later in a deep, deliberate. But the goats were untouched, as though he was only passing through. Watching, waiting, the townsfolk had kept their promise. Holloway Ridge was now marked with wooden signs carved by local hands. Wildlife sanctuary, no hunting, no traps. Collins had even arranged for a few Park Service volunteers to hike through monthly and check for signs of poachers. Most of them didn't wander far enough to reach Margaret's cabin, which suited her just fine. She had no interest in tourists or interviews. She hadn't rescued the cubs to be admired for it. She'd done it because something in her had been too tired to let them die. And in saving them, something inside her had come back to life. Still, she knew the day would come when they would need to leave. It began with Cedar. He started refusing the warm milk she brought each morning, sniffing instead at the edge of the forest where deer owls cut through the brush. Then Birch stopped sleeping inside, curling up beneath the porch instead. Even Juniper began lingering farther and farther away during their afternoon walks. Margaret didn't fight it. She knew better than to hold on too tightly. The wild didn't forgive cages, even those built with love. So she prepared. With Henry's help, she built a wooden gate at the far end of the clearing, nothing more than a symbolic threshold between the cabin and the world beyond. She scattered berries and smoked fish along the tree line to guide them. And on the first truly warm morning of spring, she opened the door and let them go. No ceremony, no speech. Just a quiet goodbye whispered into the wind. The cubs stepped out slowly, Cedar leading, his head high, his ears perked. Birch hesitated only briefly, then followed. Juniper lingered at the edge of the porch, looking back one last time. Margaret knelt and touched her nose gently. "You'll be all right, little one. You have your mother's heart." Juniper pressed into her palm for a moment, then turned and patted after her brothers. Margaret watched them disappear into the trees until the forest swallowed them completely. She stood there a long time, the wind lifting her hair, the sunlight warm on her skin, tears slipping down her face, not from sadness, but from something deeper. Acceptance, perhaps. Or peace. Henry joined her a while later, limping along with 2 cups of coffee. "You did good," he said, handing her one. "They're strong. They'll make it." She nodded, her throat tight. They're not the only ones. And days passed, then weeks. The cabin felt quieter than it had in months. Not empty. Margaret had known enough of true emptiness to know this wasn't it. But quieter, like the forest was listening rather than speaking. She fell back into her old rhythms, though they felt different now. The mornings weren't so heavy, the nights not so lonely. Sometimes she'd catch herself still pouring 3 bowls of food or glancing at the spot near the fire where Juniper used to curl. She let those moments come and go like old songs. One morning, while gathering kindling near the creek bed, she noticed the birds had gone silent. The air changed, still and thick. She stood very still, listening, and then she saw him. The grizzly, the great silent guardian. He stood across the stream, enormous and still as stone, his fur glinting in the sunlight. She didn't move. He didn't move. And then behind him she saw 3 shapes, smaller but no longer cubs. Taller now, stronger. Cedar's shoulders were broader. Birch's ears twitched with alertness. Juniper stepped closest to the water, her eyes locking with Margaret's for a single eternal moment. Margaret didn't call to them, didn't reach out. She only smiled, soft and full and aching, and dipped her head in greeting. The bear watched a moment longer, then turned and led them back into the forest, his massive form disappearing behind a veil of pine needles and shadow. Margaret stood there long after they were gone, hand resting over her heart, the wind swirling gently around her ankles like a blessing. That night, as she and Henry sat on the porch beneath the stars, a soft rustle stirred the brush nearby. A deer passed quietly. An owl called. The wind carried the scent of pine and something older, wilder. "You ever think," Henry said, sipping his cider, "that maybe you didn't just save them? Maybe they saved you too?" Margaret smiled, gaze fixed on the dark horizon. "No, I don't think it. I know it." They sat in silence for a long time after that, side by side, the warmth of the fire at their backs, the forest before them, vast and alive. And somewhere, far beyond the ridge, where the snow still lingered in the deepest shadows, 4 bears moved through the wilderness. 3 young hearts, shaped by love and survival, and 1 ancient spirit, still watching, still guarding. Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the wild speak through the trees, and for the first time in decades, she felt no fear. She had given what she could and received something immeasurable in return. Not just peace, not just purpose, but belonging. Spring gave way to summer in a slow unfolding of green and gold, and the forest, once brittle with snow and silence, now pulsed with life. Bees traced lazy arcs between wildflowers, streams trickled freely over smooth stones, and birdsong replaced the whisper of the wind. Margaret Holloway moved through it all like part of the landscape, quiet, steady, familiar. She'd taken to walking the ridge each morning, her boots worn thin at the soles, her scarf now more for habit than warmth. Each step on the damp soil was a conversation with the land, and each glance toward the treetops held a silent question. Where are they now? She didn't expect answers, but sometimes the forest gave her one anyway. A bent blade of ground, a scratch on a tree trunk, a print in the mud that was too wide to be anything but bare. She never chased them. She didn't need to. They had moved on, and so had she. Yet she remained tied to them in a way no time could loosen. The sanctuary, now officially recognized by the state, brought a few new visitors to Holloway Ridge: naturalists, quiet hikers, the occasional young ranger with a clipboard and wide eyes. They came with respect, mostly speaking in hushed voices, leaving offerings of apples and berries along the marked trail. Margaret rarely spoke to them beyond a nod or a simple morning. She had no desire to become a local legend or a symbol. She had done what she could, and that was enough. The cubs, no, not cubs anymore. The bears would write their own stories now, with paw prints and rivers and miles of forest she would never see. Henry had recovered more slowly than the season, but each day brought more color to his face, more strength to his voice. He stayed longer now, splitting his time between his own cabin and Margaret's porch, where they shared long silences and stronger coffee. Sometimes he'd talk about the pata, things neither of them had dared mention before. The fire that had taken her family, the accident that left his wife buried under a fallen tree, the choices that had led them both here, to the far edge of everything. There was a comfort in the speaking of it, not for closure, but for company. Margaret found that her heart no longer clenched when she remembered her daughter's laughter or her husband's calloused hands. The pain was still there, of course, but it had softened, like a scar smoothed over by time and sunlight. Loss had made room for something else. Not joy exactly, but a kind of grounded grace, rooted in the earth beneath her feet and the lives she had helped carry forward. One morning in late June, she awoke to find something different in the air. It wasn't a scent or a sound, not something she could name, just a shift, a sense that the forest was holding its breath. She dressed and then walked without thinking, past the goat shed, across the clearing, through the line of birch trees that had once marked the edge of her world. Her legs carried her to the stream where she had first seen him, the great bear, the sentinel. She stood on the same bank, watching the water tumble over rocks like a silver ribbon, her reflection distorted and dancing on the surface. And then, without a sound, he was there. On the opposite shore, massive and still, just as he had been that first time, His fur was darker now, thicker with age, but his eyes were unchanged, deep, steady, ancient. Margaret didn't move. She didn't need to. The bear blinked slowly, then stepped aside. From the trees behind him, three forms emerged. Taller now, broader, their youth shed like old coats. Cedar, powerful and proud, a scar tracing one ear. Birch, more deliberate, his movements cautious, observant. And Juniper, graceful, almost solemn, her eyes locking with Margaret's in that same quiet knowing. They didn't come closer. They didn't need to. It was not a reunion, but a witnessing. A moment outside time. They stood there, the five of them, separated by a stream but connected by something much deeper. After a long silence, Juniper made a low, rumbling sound, almost like a sigh, and turned away. The others followed, and the large bear, the guardian, brought up the rear, pausing only once to look back. Margaret nodded. He vanished into the woods. She stayed there long after they had gone. Not sad, not longing, just full in a way she hadn't expected. Full of a quiet knowing that they were all right, that they remembered, that she had not been just a chapter in their story, but something more enduring, a shape carved into the grain of their lives, just as they had been in hers. That evening the wind shifted again. A summer breeze this time, rustling the tall grasses and sending waves through the wildflowers. Margaret stood on the porch beside Henry, watching the horizon glow with the final light of day. "They came back," she said simply. Henry didn't ask who. He didn't need to. He reached over and took her hand, their fingers curling together like roots meeting underground. "Then they're safe," he said, "and so are we." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The moon rose, silver and full, casting a pale light over Holloway Ridge. In the distance, a howl rose from a lone wolf, answered by another, then another, the sounds carrying through the trees like threads of an old song. Margaret listened, not with fear, but with wonder. This place, once so cold and unforgiving, had become a sanctuary not just for the bears, but for her too. Not a place to hide, but a place to heal. A place where the wild was not something to be tamed, but something to be trusted. She thought about writing a letter, maybe to the state, maybe to no one in particular, something to explain what had happened here. But when she sat at the desk, pen in hand, she found there were no words that could capture it. How do you describe a bear standing watch over your cabin, or the way three cubs had curled into your side like children, or the weight of a trap in your hands as you made a choice that changed everything? No, she thought. Some things are not meant to be explained. Only lived, only remembered. She folded the blank paper and tucked it into the back of her journal. Then she stepped outside again, barefoot this time, feeling the earth beneath her toes, the soft pulse of a living world. Fireflies blinked near the edge of the woods. The stars came out one by one, and somewhere far beyond the trees, four bears moved through the dark, unseen but not lost. Margaret smiled, closed her eyes, and whispered into the night, "Thank you." The wind answered softly, and the forest, as always, listened.